Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the 2010 heist at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. We begin with the sunrise on May 20th, 2010, as security guards perform their morning rounds and discover 5 empty frames, a shattered window, and a silence that echoes through the halls of the Palais de Tokyo. Imagine the city of Paris as it breathes in the first cool air of a spring morning. The River Seine flows with a heavy, dark grace, its surface reflecting the amber glow of the street lamps that have yet to realize the sun is rising. There is a mist that clings to the stone bridges, a damp veil that softens the sharp edges of the architecture. The Eiffel Tower stands as a silent sentinel in the distance, its golden beam having swept over the city all through the night, unaware of the shadows moving beneath it. Everything is still, a moment held in the balance between the secrets of the night and the clarity of the day. The Musée d'Art Moderne sits within the eastern wing of the Palais de Tokyo, a grand and imposing structure that speaks of history and the weight of human creativity. Its walls are thick, made of light-colored stone that seems to absorb the pale morning light. On this particular Thursday morning, the air inside is cool and perfectly still. The museum is a labyrinth of quiet rooms, each one housing decades of thought, color, and emotion. The high ceilings create a sense of vastness, where even the smallest sound might travel for 100 feet before fading away into the corners. Usually, this silence is sacred, a protective layer for the masterpieces that hang upon the walls. But today, the silence feels different. It is heavy, expectant, and brittle. The air carries a faint scent of old floor wax and the lingering coolness of the stone. Outside, the leafy 16th district of Paris begins to stir. But here, within these grand galleries, time remains frozen, waiting for the first pair of eyes to see what the night has taken away. At exactly 6:50 in the morning, the rhythm of the museum is dictated by the steady, measured footsteps of the security guards. There are 3 of them on duty during the night shift, moving through the darkness with a familiarity born of long hours and quiet shifts. Think of the sound of their shoes, a soft, repetitive clicking on the polished parquet floors. It is a sound that usually brings comfort, a sign that all is well in the house of art. One of the guards moves through the darkened hallways, his flashlight casting a narrow, focused beam that dances across the frames of countless works of art. The light catches the texture of the oil paint, the subtle sheen of the varnish, and the ornate edges of the heavy frames. He moves with a slow, hypnotic pace, his mind perhaps already drifting toward the end of his shift and the warmth of a morning coffee. He passes through the galleries of the permanent collection, unaware that the air in the next room is flowing from a place it should not be. As he enters the next gallery, the guard's light sweeps across the floor, and the first sign of the intrusion reveals itself. There is glass, shimmering, translucent shards that catch the flashlight's beam like fallen diamonds. The window, which should have been a solid barrier against the world, has been violated. One of the reinforced panes has been removed with such precision that it seems almost impossible. The guard stops. The rhythmic clicking of his footsteps ceases, replaced by the sound of his own slow, shallow breathing. He feels the sudden intrusion of the outside air, a sharp, cool draft that smells of the river and the city's early morning traffic. It is a foreign presence in this climate-controlled sanctuary. He slowly raises his light toward the walls, and the heart of the mystery begins to beat. Where there should be color and form, there is only the pale, stark geometry of the museum's white walls. The frames are there, but they are hollow. They are like open mouths, silent and gaping in the dark. In the beam of the flashlight, the devastation becomes clear. 5 masterpieces have vanished. The most profound absence is felt where Pablo Picasso's dove with green peas once resided. This cubist work, painted in 1911 with its earthy ochres and deep browns, is gone, leaving behind nothing but the dark shadow of its former presence on the wall. Next to it, the empty space where Henry Matisse's pastoral once hung feels like a physical ache. The guard moves his light further, discovering the missing olive tree near Estac by Georges Braque, and the woman with a fan by Amedeo Modigliani. Finally, the light finds the empty place of Fernand Léger's still life with chandeliers. These 5 works, valued at over 100 million euros, have been taken with a surgical calmness. There are no signs of a struggle, no jagged edges where the canvas was ripped. The thief did not use a knife, he used patience. He removed the paintings from their frames with care, as if he were tucking them into a long, dark sleep. The guard stands in the center of the room, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He looks at the security cameras, those unblinking electronic eyes that should have alerted the world to this crime. But there was no alarm. The system, which had been suffering from a technical malfunction since March 30th, remained silent throughout the night. It is a staggering realization that the crown jewels of the city's modern art collection were left vulnerable to a single masked figure who moved through the shadows like a phantom. The 100 million euro silence is now broken by the frantic calls for the police and the arrival of the elite Brigade de Repression du Banditisme. As the sun fully rises over Paris, casting long, golden shadows across the floor of the museum, the world begins to learn of the heist of the century. The city wakes up to a loss it cannot yet measure, while the 5 paintings begin their journey into the unknown, leaving behind only the ghost of their beauty in a quiet morning in May. The city of Paris at 3:45 in the morning is a place of ghosts and gray echoes. The vibrant pulse of the boulevards has long since faded, replaced by a heavy, damp silence that rolls off the river Seine like a velvet shroud. It is a time when the world feels suspended between what was and what will be, a thin veil where the shadows seem to stretch and breathe. Near the edge of the water, not far from where the golden beam of the Eiffel Tower sweeps rhythmically across the sky, a single figure moves with a purpose that defies the stillness. This is the hour of the spider. It is the 20th of May, in the year 2010, and the air is thick with the scent of wet stone and ancient river water. The museum stands as a monolith of culture, a fortress of glass and concrete that houses the dreams of the 20th century. Yet tonight, it is merely an obstacle for a man who has spent his life learning how to navigate the impossible. The man is Vjeran Tomic. He stands 6 feet and 2 inches tall, an imposing presence composed of lean muscle and quiet focus. In the underworld, they call him the Spider-Man, a name earned through years of scaling the impossible heights of Parisian apartment blocks and dancing across rooftops where the only audience was the moon. He does not move with the frantic energy of a common thief. His movements are measured, rhythmic, and almost beautiful in their efficiency. Tonight, he is dressed in dark, functional clothing that absorbs the ambient light of the city. He carries the tools of his trade not in a specialized kit, but as extensions of his own hands. There is no high-tech laser grid to bypass, no complex computer system to hack. Instead, there is only the physical reality of metal, glass, and the profound silence of a security system that has forgotten how to watch. He reaches the perimeter gate first. It is a heavy thing, a barrier of wrought iron and industrial locks designed to keep the world at bay. Tomic produces a pair of bolt cutters. The metal is cold against his palms, the weight of the tool familiar and grounding. He positions the jaws around the padlock. There is a specific tension in the moment, a slow buildup of pressure as he squeezes the handles. He feels the resistance of the steel, the way it bites back before finally yielding. The sound of the lock snapping is a sharp, metallic crack that seems to echo for miles in the pre-dawn quiet, yet no one hears it. The guards inside are miles away in their own minds, perhaps distracted by the flickering blue light of a television or the rhythm of their own breathing. The gate swings open with a soft, rusted groan, a sound like a long-held breath finally being released, and the Spider-Man slips through, disappearing into the inner courtyard. Now he faces the window. This is not a sudden breach. It is the culmination of 6 nights of patient, invisible labor. For nearly a week, Tomic has returned to this specific spot, hidden from the unblinking eyes of the security cameras. Using a simple screwdriver, he has meticulously worked at the screws holding the window frame in place. Imagine the patience required for such a task. The way he would turn the tool just a few degrees each night, feeling the metal give way beneath the pressure of his thumb, then carefully replacing the paint so that the tampering remained invisible to the casual observer. He treats the window frame with the reverence a restorer might show a canvas. Tonight, only one screw remains. He fits the screwdriver into the final slot, the metal making a tiny, scratching sound that is lost to the wind. With a final, gentle twist, the frame is free. He can feel the slight vibration of the glass, the weight of it pressing against his fingertips, a heavy sheet of transparency that is all that stands between him and 100 million euros worth of history. The removal of the glass is a delicate dance of physics and nerves. Tomic knows that if the pane slips, if it shatters against the stone floor inside, the game is over. He uses suction cups, pressing them firmly against the cold surface until they grip with a wet, rubbery thud. He leans back, using his body weight to pull the heavy pane outward. It moves slowly, fighting against the seal of decades. The air from inside the museum, stagnant, temperature-controlled, and smelling faintly of old paper and oil paint, escapes through the gap, meeting the fresh, damp air of the Paris night. It is a transition of worlds. He lowers the glass to the ground, placing it so gently that it makes no more sound than a falling leaf. He stands there for a moment, poised on the threshold, listening to the heartbeat of the building. There is no siren. There is no flashing red light. The motion sensors, which should have detected the change in pressure or the warmth of his breath, remain stubbornly green or entirely dark, victims of a maintenance backlog that has left the museum vulnerable. He steps through the opening. His boots make a soft, rhythmic thud against the polished floors, a sound so quiet it would be drowned out by the hum of a refrigerator. Inside, the darkness is different. It is an intentional darkness, designed to preserve the colors of the masterpieces that line the walls. Tomic moves with the grace of an athlete, his eyes adjusting to the deep shadows. He knows exactly where he is going. He has walked these halls as a visitor, scouting the positions of the sensors, marking the ones that did not blink, the ones that were dead to the world. He moves through the gallery like a ghost passing through a dream. To his left and right, the shapes of sculptures rise up like sentinels, their marble forms pale and indifferent. He does not look at them. His eyes are fixed ahead, toward the room that holds the work of Fernand Léger. This was supposed to be a simple job, a single theft ordered by a dealer with a specific taste. But as he moves through the silence, as he realizes how truly alone he is in this sanctuary of art, a new thought begins to take root in his mind. Why take only one, when the world has left the doors to the treasure house wide open? The silence of the museum is a heavy, living thing. It presses against the skin, thick with the scent of old floor wax and the ghost of 1,000 daytime footsteps. In the dim spill of the thief's flashlight, the first masterpiece reveals itself. This is Le Pigeon aux Petits Pois, a radical creation of Pablo Picasso from 1911. It is a cornerstone of analytical cubism, a world fractured into 1,000 facets of ochre and deep, earthen brown. As the beam of light moves across the surface, the geometric shapes seem to shift and pulse. You can almost feel the heat of the Parisian café, where the artist first imagined this bird, its form broken down into a complex puzzle of lines and shadows. The thief does not pause to admire the intellectual depth of the work, yet there is a deliberate slowness to his movements. He feels the tension of the canvas, the way the oil paint has settled into the fabric over nearly a century. With a surgeon's precision, he begins to separate the art from its wooden home. The sound of the blade slicing through the edges is a sharp, clean whisper in the dark, a final severance from the security of the museum's walls. He moves with the grace of a shadow toward the next gallery, where the air seems to grow warmer, more vibrant. Here hangs Henry Matisse's La Pastorale, painted in 1905. It is an explosion of color that defies the darkness of the room. In the glow of the torch, the canvas radiates with a dreamlike intensity. We see an idyllic landscape where four figures rest in a state of eternal peace, one of them lost in the melody of a flute. The palette is a defiance of reality. Tree trunks rendered in startling reds and shadows that fall in soft, lavender pools. This was the dawn of fauvism, a movement that sought to liberate color from the constraints of nature. The figures are simple, almost abstract, inviting the viewer to step into a visual refuge of serenity. As the thief works, the vibrant greens and pinks of the meadow seem to shimmer under the artificial light. He is not merely taking a piece of fabric. He is stealing a piece of a lost Arcadia, a vision of beauty that was meant to be shared by all. The emptiness left on the wall as the canvas falls away is a quiet tragedy, a hole in the narrative of modern art. In the same corridor, he finds Georges Braque's Olive Tree near L'Estaque. Created in 1906, this work captures a moment when the artist was still enamored with the wild colors of the South. The olive tree leans into the frame from the left, its trunk a mosaic of pink and red dabs that suggest the scorching heat of a Mediterranean afternoon. The ground is a golden carpet, and the sky is a pale, impossible green. It is a painting of movement and light, where every brushstroke carries the weight of the wind through the leaves. Braque, who would later become a partner to Picasso in the birth of Cubism, here celebrates the raw, unrefined power of nature. The thief's hands are steady as he handles the frame. He can feel the texture of the impasto, the thickness of the paint where Braque applied it with a firm, decisive gesture. There is a profound irony in the way these works, which were created to challenge the boundaries of perception, are now being reduced to cargo. They are becoming ghosts even before they leave the building, their history and meaning stripped away in the name of a hidden transaction. The journey continues into the 1920s. Fernand Léger's Nature Mort aux Chandeliers, from 1922, offers a stark contrast to the fluid lines of the earlier works. This is a world of mechanical stability, of bold black outlines and primary colors that pulse with industrial strength. Interlocking vertical and horizontal forms create a sense of order and permanence, a rational response to the chaos of the world. The candlesticks stand tall, their forms simplified into powerful icons of everyday life. In the quiet of the night, the painting feels monolithic, a monument to the strength of human construction. The thief treats it with a practiced indifference, though the sheer size of the canvas requires more effort to manage. The stability that Léger intended to project is betrayed by the vulnerability of the object itself. It is a reminder that even the most formidable creations are at the mercy of a single, determined individual. The metallic click of the thief's tools against the frame echoes through the hall, a cold, rhythmic punctuation to the theft of history. Finally, he stands before the most haunting of the five. Amedeo Modigliani's La Femme à l'Eventail, painted in 1919, just a year before the artist's untimely death. The subject is Lunia Czechowska, a close friend and muse. She gazes out from the scarlet background with a serenity that borders on sorrow. Her neck is elongated like a swan's, her almond-shaped eyes are void of pupils, yet they seem to see everything. She holds a fan with a delicate grace, her yellow dress forming soft curves against the fiery backdrop. This is a portrait of a soul laid bare, a testament to Modigliani's obsession with the human essence. The paint is thin in places, almost like a stain, revealing the intimacy of the artist's touch. As the thief rolls the canvas, the gaze of the woman seems to follow him, a silent witness to her own disappearance. She is a symbol of the immense cultural weight of this loss. These 5 masterpieces, spanning less than 20 years of human creativity, represent a bridge between the old world and the new. Now they are bundled together, 100 million euros of genius reduced to a single, anonymous package, ready to vanish into the Parisian night. The silence in the Musée d'Art Moderne that morning was not the usual heavy, reverent quiet of a house of culture. It was a hollow silence, a vacuum where a digital scream should have been. In the world of high-stakes security, there is a concept known as the grid, an invisible architecture of infrared beams and microwave pulses that weave a protective shroud around the priceless and the ancient. It is designed to be a living thing, a nervous system that never sleeps, capable of detecting the weight of a single shadow moving across a floor. But as the investigators arrived in the pale, gray light of dawn on the 20th of May, 2010, they found a system that was not just asleep, but paralyzed. They stood in the grand galleries, their breath visible in the chilled air, looking up at the small, plastic eyes mounted in the corners of the ceilings. These were the passive infrared motion detectors, the final line of defense. They were meant to be the guardians of the Matisse and the Picasso, yet they had remained dark and indifferent as the thief moved beneath them. The technicians began their work with a slow, clinical precision, their flashlights cutting through the gloom to illuminate the tiny lenses that had failed to see. When they opened the control panels, the truth began to emerge in the form of a digital record of neglect. The failure of the grid was not a sudden catastrophe or a clever hack by a technological mastermind. Instead, it was a slow, quiet decay. As the specialized police units combed through the system logs, they discovered a date that would come to haunt the museum's administration: March 30th, 2010. More than 6 weeks before the heist, a technical malfunction had been logged. A single, critical component in the main alarm processor had faltered, sending a ripple of instability through the entire network. In the following days, a series of repair orders had been drafted, printed on thick, white paper and signed by mid-level officials. There is something deeply unsettling about the way a physical document can represent the vulnerability of a masterpiece. Each signature was a testament to a plan that was never executed. The paperwork moved from desk to desk, caught in the slow-moving gears of municipal bureaucracy. It sat in outboxes and awaited approvals, while the sensors in the very rooms holding the world's heritage remained in a state of digital limbo. The grid was not broken by a wire cutter. It was suffocated by a paper trail. Imagine the thief, the one they would later call the Spider-Man, standing in these halls during the days leading up to his strike. He was not just a climber, he was a careful observer of the mechanical world. As he walked through the galleries, disguised as a common tourist, he would have looked up at those sensors. In a fully functional system, a tiny light on the sensor's face would blink from green to red as a person passed, a silent acknowledgement that they were being tracked. But as he wandered past the Braque and the Modigliani, the lights remained a steady, frozen green. The sensors were receiving power, but they were no longer communicating with the brain of the museum. To the guards in the monitoring room, everything appeared normal on their screens, but the reality was that they were watching a frozen ghost of a system. The thief saw the vulnerability for exactly what it was. He saw that the state-of-the-art technology had become nothing more than plastic and glass. He could feel the lack of resistance in the air, a path cleared not by magic, but by a missing circuit board that was still sitting in a box at a warehouse across the city, waiting for a technician who would arrive far too late. The investigators spent hours tracing the physical wires that ran through the walls of the Palais de Tokyo. These wires, thin and copper-colored, are the veins of the museum. They should have carried the electrical pulse of an alarm the moment the window frame was disturbed. Instead, they found that the bypasses put in place during the malfunction had rendered entire sectors of the building invisible. The failure was so complete that the three-night watchmen, men tasked with the protection of millions of euros worth of art, heard nothing but the ambient hum of the ventilation system. They made their rounds with a false sense of security, trusting in a machine that had been lobotomized by its own maintenance schedule. There is a specific kind of irony in the fact that the museum was guarded by 30 high-definition cameras, yet not a single alarm sounded to tell the humans to look at the monitors. The technology acted as a witness to the crime, recording the intruder's every move in high resolution, but it was a silent witness, a mute spectator to its own irrelevance. The police watched the footage later, seeing the thief's slow, rhythmic movements, his total lack of haste, knowing that he was aware of the silence better than anyone else. The technical report would eventually describe the situation as a catastrophic convergence of human and technical deficiency. It wasn't just that the sensors were old, or that the system was complex. It was that the very idea of security had been replaced by the appearance of security. For weeks, the masterpieces had been held in place by little more than their own weight and the thin, wooden frames that surrounded them. The delayed repair orders, the missed appointments for the spare parts, and the ignored warning lights created a window of opportunity that was as clear and wide as the one the thief eventually unscrewed. As the sun climbed higher over the Seine, the reality of the loss began to settle into the stone floors of the museum. The grid had failed because it was treated as a luxury rather than a necessity. The investigation showed that a simple manual entry, a task that should have been impossible in a modern facility, was achieved through the most mundane of means. The screws on the window were old and caked with layers of paint, the locks were simple mechanical devices, and the motion sensors were merely decorative. The safety of the art had been an illusion, a fragile dream of protection that vanished the moment a real hand reached out to touch it in the dark. The small security office at the museum was thick with the scent of ozone and the quiet, persistent hum of vintage hard drives. As the detectives gathered around the glow of the singular monitor, the room seemed to shrink, the blue light of the screens washing over their tired faces like a cold tide. It was late, or perhaps very early, and the world outside the Palais de Tokyo was still cloaked in the heavy velvet of a Parisian night. They pressed play, and the digital static began to swirl, a mosaic of charcoal and slate gray that eventually resolved into the empty corridors of the gallery. For several long, agonizing minutes, there was nothing but the silence of the screen, the unblinking eye of the camera watching the still canvases. Then, at the very edge of the frame, a flicker of movement occurred. It wasn't a sudden burst or a clumsy stumble, but a ripple in the darkness so subtle that it might have been mistaken for a trick of the light. The investigators held their collective breath as the void finally yielded a shape, a solitary figure stepping out from the shadows near the lower window. This was the moment the abstract mystery of the missing masterpieces became a tangible, haunting reality. The figure on the screen was a study in absolute composure. He did not possess the frantic, jerky energy common to the opportunistic thief. Instead, he moved with a fluid, liquid grace that seemed to belong more to a predator of the night than a human being. He was dressed entirely in black, a form-fitting uniform that swallowed the dim, ambient light. The resolution of the footage was poor, the pixels dancing and shifting like a swarm of insects across the intruder's silhouette, yet his confidence was unmistakable. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't hesitate. As he walked across the polished floors, his boots made no sound that the recording could catch, leaving the room in a state of eerie, suspended animation. The detectives leaned in closer, searching for a lapse, a moment of doubt, or a distinctive gait that might betray his identity. But the silhouette remained an enigma of geometry and shadow, a ghost navigating a world of stone and paint. Every movement was deliberate, every step measured with the precision of a clockmaker. As they watched the intruder navigate the labyrinth of the museum, a chilling realization began to settle over the investigative team. The thief did not wander aimlessly or search for the exits. He knew exactly where the cameras were positioned, and more importantly, he knew where they were blind. He stayed perfectly to the left of the central line in the gallery, hugging the curvature of the marble pillars with a surgical accuracy that kept him at the extreme periphery of the lens. It was a dance choreographed by someone who had spent hundreds of hours studying the architecture of the museum's security. He moved through the space not as an intruder, but as if he were the one who had designed the layout himself. There was a terrifying intelligence in the way he bypassed the infrared barriers, sliding through the gaps in the electronic net with the ease of a silk thread through a needle. He wasn't just lucky, he was informed. He was a specialist who had mapped the vulnerabilities of the building until they were as familiar to him as the lines on his own palm. The footage showed him stopping before the first work on his list, the ledger. He stood there for a few seconds, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as if he were admiring the composition before beginning his work. The way he handled the canvas was almost reverent, his gloved hands moving with a gentleness that suggested he understood the true value of what he was touching. When the alarms failed to scream, when the guards did not come running, the intruder did not panic at the silence. Instead, he seemed to grow even calmer. He took his time, moving from one masterpiece to the next with a methodical patience that was deeply unsettling to those watching the recording. One by one, the Picasso, the Matisse, the Braque, and the Modigliani were relieved of their frames. He worked in the dark with the confidence of a man who could see through the layers of the night. The detectives watched him roll the canvases, his movements echoing the careful touch of a surgeon. There was no haste, only the steady, rhythmic execution of a professional who knew that, for this one night, the museum belonged entirely to him. By the time the silhouette finally faded back into the shadows of the broken window, the atmosphere in the security room had changed. The theory of a disorganized gang or a group of desperate looters had evaporated. The detectives were now looking at the work of a singular, elite operator. They began to speak in hushed tones about the Spider-Man of Paris, a name that felt both romantic and dangerous. They looked at the empty frames on the walls of the screen, and then back at the grainy, flickering image of the man who had walked through walls of light without casting a shadow. He had been so invisible, so quiet, that even the digital eyes of the museum seemed to have failed to truly capture him. The investigation was no longer a simple search for stolen property. It was a pursuit of a phantom who had mastered the art of disappearance. As the tape reached its end, and the screen turned to a steady, buzzing field of gray, the detectives sat in the silence of the basement, wondering how you catch a man who knows exactly how to remain unseen in a world that is always watching. Within the weathered stone walls of the 36 Quai des Orfèvres, the offices of the Brigade de Répression du Banditisme hummed with a quiet, persistent energy that felt at odds with the stillness of the night. The detectives of the BRB were not like the beat cops or the frantic forensic technicians who had swarmed the museum only hours earlier. They were the seasoned hunters of the professional underworld, men and women who understood the rhythm of the city's criminal heartbeat as if it were their own. On their desks lay the files of the 5 stolen masterpieces, a Picasso, a Matisse, a Braque, a Modigliani, and a ledger. These were not merely canvases. They were irreplaceable fragments of human history, now vanished into the heavy, velvet void of the Parisian night. The initial rush of the crime scene had faded, replaced by the slow, methodical process of canvassing the city. The work of the BRB often happens in the hushed tones of a conversation over a bitter, lukewarm espresso, or the sharp, singular scratching of a match in a damp alleyway. They reached out to their vast network of informants, those known in the trade as the indicators. These were the shadows who lived between two worlds, trading whispered secrets for leniency or small, crumpled stacks of cash. The investigators moved through the 10th and 11th districts, meeting men who knew the secret movements of the black market. They asked about any whispers of a stolen toward job, or if any known burglars had been bragging about a score that would change their lives. The response, however, was a chilling and heavy silence. In the underworld, a common thief might steal a watch or a car, but these 5 paintings were different. They were too big, too loud, and far too famous. As the moon hung low over the Seine, the investigators pondered the unique and terrible burden of the stolen art. To the public, the haul was worth 100 million euros, perhaps even more. But in the cold, transactional reality of the black market, a painting that every border guard and customs agent in the world has memorized is practically worthless. You cannot melt down a Matisse to hide its origin. You cannot spend a Picasso at a high-stakes table in a casino. These works were white elephants. They were treasures that demanded everything and gave nothing back but an immense, crushing risk. Expert investigators knew that such famous works often become burning assets. They burn the fingers of anyone who dares to touch them, leaving a trail of heat that the police can follow for years. The high-stakes game of illicit art trading is rarely about a wealthy collector in a bunker. Consider the Picasso, titled The Pigeon with Green Peas. It is an intricate, intellectual web of ochre and brown, a masterpiece of cubism that challenges the very way the human eye perceives the world. Now it was likely wrapped in a rough, moth-eaten wool blanket or hidden behind the false wall of a humid, forgotten basement. The detectives imagined the Matisse, titled Pastoral, with its vibrant, joyful nudes on a hillside, now stripped of its gilded frame and rolled into a tight, suffocating cylinder. The tragedy of the heist was not just the financial loss, but the sensory deprivation of the art itself. These were objects meant to be bathed in the soft, controlled light of a grand museum, studied by eyes filled with wonder. Instead, they were likely gathering dust in the dark, their ancient pigments slowly cracking in the silence of a criminal hideout, waiting for a light that might never come. The struggle for the fence, the middleman who must move the goods, is an agonizing and lonely one. They must find a buyer who is comfortable with the ultimate, bitter irony, owning a world-renowned treasure that they can never, ever show to another living soul. It is a paranoid existence, spent in rooms with drawn curtains. The BRB focused their attention on the known dealers of the gray market, the small antique shops that occasionally looked the other way, and the galleries with deep connections to the periphery of the law. They watched for any sudden, unexplained shifts in wealth or unusual travel patterns to the east. They knew that the thief, however skilled he was at scaling walls, was now a prisoner of his own success. Every siren in the distance, every heavy footfall in the hallway, would sound like a final judgment. The 5 paintings were no longer prizes, they were heavy anchors. The investigation stretched deep into the early hours of the morning, the reports piling up like fallen leaves on the detectives' desks. There were no immediate breakthroughs, only the steady, rhythmic accumulation of dead ends and silent phones. The underworld was keeping its secrets close, perhaps out of a shared sense of awe or a collective fear of the intense heat this heist had brought down upon the city. The detectives of the BRB stared at the photographs of the empty frames, the ghosts of the masterpieces still haunting the white walls of the museum, waiting for the truth to surface. The city slept, unaware of the treasures hidden in its cracks. In the silence of the aftermath, the investigators did not find a shattered entryway or the frantic mess of an amateur. Instead, they found a quiet, almost respectful precision. The first breadcrumb was the padlock. It did not look as though it had been beaten into submission. It had been severed with a single, clean stroke of a heavy-duty tool, the metal surrendering without a scream. It lay there on the cold pavement of the museum exterior, a small, heavy piece of evidence that suggested the intruder knew exactly how much force was required, and not a single Newton more. The detectives knelt by it, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the gray morning mist. They looked at the marks on the shackle, noting the lack of jagged edges. This was the work of someone who understood the anatomy of a lock perfectly. They studied the silver metal for a long time. Then there was the window. A single pane of glass, seemingly untouched from a distance, revealed a haunting level of patience upon closer inspection. This was not a break-in, it was a disassembly. For 6 consecutive nights, the shadow had returned to this spot, hidden behind a large sheet of black cloth that blended into the Parisian night. He had not used a hammer. He had used a chemical solvent, a specific brand of spray-on paint stripper, to slowly eat away at the layers of old, hardened paint that encased the screws of the window frame. The detectives found the residue, a faint, sticky ghost of the substance that allowed the intruder to reach the metal beneath. It was a slow process, a test of nerves that most criminals would never endure. One screw at a time, he had unturned the history of the building. It was a masterpiece of careful preparation for him. Inside the gallery, the evidence of this surgical intent became even more unsettling to the team. The frames remained, but the souls of the paintings were gone. 5 masterpieces had been removed, but they had not been sliced out with the jagged haste of a common thief. There were no ragged threads of canvas fluttering in the drafty hall. Instead, the thief had taken the time to carefully remove the paintings from their wooden stretchers, handling the fabric with the delicacy of a professional restorer. The investigators traced the edges where the canvas had once met the wood, finding the neat rows of staple holes and the absence of any frantic tearing. This person did not just want the value of the art. They seemed to have a terrifying familiarity with the way a masterpiece is actually constructed and held together in its wooden housing. As the sun rose higher over the River Seine, the profile of the suspect began to take a distinct, athletic shape. The detectives looked at the height of the entry point and the path required to reach it without triggering the motion sensors. They began to speak of a man who could scale the vertical heights of the city with the grace of a trained acrobat. Rumors of a climber, a figure dubbed the Spider-Man in the backrooms of the precinct, began to circulate once more. They remembered older cases where windows had been breached at impossible heights, and jewelry had vanished from the bedside tables of sleeping socialites. The precision of the cut on the padlock and the patience with the window screws suggested a criminal who viewed the architecture of Paris as a private, high-altitude playground. He was a phantom of the rooftops. The scent of the chemical stripper lingered in the cracks of the stone, a sharp, acidic bite that contrasted with the smell of old oil paint and floor wax. It was a brand often used by restorers, a detail that narrowed the search. But it was the combination of this tool with the physical prowess of a parkour athlete that truly baffled the team. How does a man possess both the strength to haul himself up a sheer wall and the steady hand to perform a 6-night chemical excavation? They followed the trail of breadcrumbs further, finding a few faint smudges on the sill, not fingerprints, but the texture of specialized climbing gloves. Every piece of evidence felt like a deliberate signature of a man who was as comfortable in the shadows as he was on the rooftops. He was a thief with the soul of an artist. The detectives stood back, looking at the void left by the Picasso and the Matisse. The trail was thin, made of metal shavings and chemical scents, but it was enough to begin the hunt. They knew they were not looking for a gang. They were looking for a solitary ghost. The investigation into the void at the museum did not start with a face, but with a feeling of impossible physics. As the detectives stood within the cold, silent galleries of the Museum of Modern Art, they were forced to look not just at the empty frames, but at the heights of the walls. The perpetrator had moved through the space like a ghost, or perhaps like something less human. While the city of Paris slept beneath a blanket of silver mist, a name began to circulate in the quietest corners of the police headquarters. It was a name that carried the weight of the mountains and the silence of the rooftops: Vjeran Tomic. To the world, he would eventually be known by a more theatrical title, a name borrowed from comic books and urban legends. They called him the Spider-Man. But before the headlines, before the trial, and before the confession, there was only the man and the vertical world he called home. To understand how he vanished with 5 masterpieces, one must first understand the spirit of a man who saw the architecture of the city not as a barrier, but as a map. Vjeran was born in the year 1968, here in the heart of Paris, though his early roots stretched across the borders into the rugged landscapes of Bosnia. As a young boy, he was sent to live with his grandmother in a place where the air was thin and the earth was made of ancient stone. It was there, among the bridges and the steep riverbanks, that he discovered the strange, quiet power of his own limbs. He was only 6 years old when he began to scale the stone structures of his youth, feeling the rough texture of the masonry beneath his small fingertips. He was a child who raised himself, finding a sense of belonging in the solitude of the climb. By the time he returned to Paris at the age of 10, the city looked different to him than it did to the crowds below. Where others saw a grand boulevard or a formidable limestone facade, Vjeran saw a series of holds, cracks, and ledges. He was a creature of the heights, a silent observer who preferred the company of the gargoyles and the cold, night wind to the friction of the crowded streets. As he grew into a man standing 6 feet and 2 inches tall, his physicality became a finely tuned instrument. He did not possess the heavy, lumbering strength of a common burglar. Instead, he moved with the rhythmic grace of a dancer, his long arms and legs finding purchase on surfaces that seemed perfectly smooth to the naked eye. In his earlier years, he had spent hours in the famous cemetery of Père Lachaise, practicing the art of parkour amongst the mausoleums. He learned the exact pressure required to pull himself over a gate, and the precise way to breathe so that his heartbeat remained steady even when he was dangling 40 feet above the pavement. There is a specific sound to the city at that height. It is a low, constant hum, punctuated by the distant whistle of a train or the soft rustle of leaves in the Tuileries. For Vjeran, this was the music of his work. He had spent his life preparing for the 2010 heist, though he may not have known it at the time. He was a man who truly loved the art he sought, but perhaps he loved the ascent even more. The break in the case did not come from a fingerprint or a high-tech forensic breakthrough. It came from the eyes of a man who lived on the margins of the city. In the days leading up to the theft, a homeless man had been resting near the museum, watching the ebb and flow of the tourists and the guards. He had noticed a tall, athletic figure lingering near the building, a man who seemed to be studying the windows with an intensity that transcended simple curiosity. This anonymous witness provided the spark that the Brigade de Repression du Banditisme needed. When the tip reached the detectives, they began to weave their own web. They turned to the digital trails that even a ghost leaves behind. They tracked mobile phone signals that had flickered near the museum on that fateful night in May, tracing a path that led away from the River Seine, through the winding metro lines, and eventually into the central heart of the city. The shadows were starting to take a definite shape, and that shape belonged to the climber. The surveillance operation was a masterclass in patience. The police did not rush to make an arrest. They wanted to see where the Spider-Man would lead them. They sat in unmarked vans, the air inside thick with the scent of stale coffee and the quiet crackle of radio static. They watched Vjeran as he moved through the city, noting the way he still looked upward at the buildings he passed. One afternoon, they followed him to the Centre Pompidou, another bastion of modern art. They watched through binoculars as he stood near the emergency exits, his eyes scanning the security cameras and the locking mechanisms with a practiced, professional gaze. It was a chilling sight for the investigators. They realized they weren't just watching a thief who had gotten lucky once. They were watching a predator who was already considering his next move. Every step he took was calculated, every glance was a measurement. The detectives kept their distance, anchored to the pavement, while their target seemed to exist in a world just slightly above them, always looking for the next ledge. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure began to mount. The paintings were still missing. The Picasso, the Matisse, the Modigliani, all vanished into the vast, gray expanse of the Parisian underworld. The police listened to intercepted phone calls, hearing whispers of deals and disappointments. Vjeran was not a man of grand greed. He had originally been commissioned to steal only the ledger for a sum of 40,000 euros. But once he was inside, once he realized the alarms were silent and the guards were oblivious, his own appreciation for beauty took over. He had wandered the galleries for over an hour, selecting the works he liked, as if he were a private collector in his own gallery. This was the paradox of the Spider-Man. He was a master of the physical world, a man who could conquer any height, yet he was caught in the very human trap of his own desires. He couldn't help but touch the canvases, feeling the frozen fear of the masterpieces as he cut them from their frames. The web was closing in now, a slow and deliberate tightening of the circle around the man who thought he could outrun the earth itself. The investigation meandered into the dim alleyways and shuttered storefronts of the Parisian art trade. To find the masterpieces, the police had to look beyond the thief and toward the men who dwelled in the shadows of legitimate business. They looked toward Jean Mitchell Corvez. His antique shop was tucked away from the grand boulevards, a place where the air was thick with the scent of aged mahogany and the fine, gray dust of centuries. Corvez was a man of 61 years, an antiques dealer who understood that every object has a secret history. In his world, a beautiful thing was rarely just a piece of art. It was a currency, a leverage, a silent witness to a deal made in whispers. He was a man who knew how to wait, how to listen, and how to make the impossible vanish into the mundane corners of a cluttered room. Corvez was the architect, having initially sought one ledger for an unnamed client. He did not seek the fame of a heist. He sought the quiet satisfaction of a successful transaction. When the thief returned with 5 canvases, Corvez was stunned. The haul was too great, the heat too intense. The Picasso, the Matisse, the Braque, they were ghosts that could not be easily hidden among the porcelain vases and gilded mirrors of his shop. He needed a place of absolute safety, a sanctuary where the ticking of a clock would drown out the rising clamor of the international press. The tension in the shop must have been palpable, the light through the dusty windows illuminating the vibrant colors of the stolen world that now rested on his workbench. And so, he turned to a friend, a man who lived a life of even greater precision and silence than himself. Jonathan Byrne, aged 40, was an expert in the internal rhythms of luxury watches. His workshop was a place of monastic focus, illuminated by a single, sharp beam of light that caught the glint of brass gears and silver springs. The sound of his world was a constant, rhythmic ticking, 1,000 tiny heartbeats competing for attention. To Byrne, beauty was found in the intricate and the exact. When Corvez brought him the stolen canvases, they were not merely objects to be sold. They were revelations. Byrne agreed to store them, perhaps because he was seduced by the sheer, overwhelming presence of such genius. He took the Modigliani and placed it within the dark silence of a bank deposit box, while the others were wrapped in simple sheets and hidden behind a heavy metal closet in his modest home, where they would rest in the dark for many months. For months, the masterpieces rested against a common wall, hidden by mundane clutter. Byrne lived with them, breathing the same air as the Pastoral by Matisse and the Olive Tree by Braque. In the quiet hours of the night, while the rest of Paris slept, he may have stood before them, the watchmaker marveling at the brushstrokes that defied the mechanical order of his own trade. He was not a coarse man. He was a lover of the aesthetic, a man who claimed to have committed the worst error of his existence not out of greed, but out of a sudden, blinding panic. The pressure of the investigation was a tightening vice, a slow-motion collapse that finally reached its breaking point in May of 2011. You can almost feel the air growing thin as the net began to close, the steady ticking of his clocks becoming in countdown toward an inevitable confrontation. When the news of arrests reached Byrne, his calculated world shattered. He described the moment with a visceral clarity during his trial years later. He spoke of a fear so absolute that it clouded his reason. In his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his craft, he claimed to have taken the canvases, and with hands that once repaired the finest movements, he broke them. The sound of the wooden stretcher bars snapping must have been like a gunshot in the small room. He told the court that he kicked the frames apart, his feet crushing the very things he had once admired. Then, he took the remains and carried them to the street, where he dropped them into a common green rubbish bin. It was a choice that would haunt the history of art forever, a moment of madness born from the very beauty he claimed to love. He wept as he told the story, claiming the canvases were lost to a garbage truck's jaws. It is a story that feels like a physical blow. Yet in the courtroom, there was a heavy, lingering doubt. His co-defendants did not believe him. The judge did not believe him. They whispered that a man as intelligent as Byrne, a man who understood the value of beauty, could never truly destroy such treasures. They suspected the paintings had been spirited away to wait in the dark. But for now, the frames remain empty. The watchmaker's hands are still, and the 5 masterpieces exist only in our memories and the quiet, empty spaces of the museum walls. We are left only with the silence of the ticking clocks and the hope that somewhere, behind a different wall, the colors are still vibrant, waiting for the light to find them once again. The morning air in Paris during those months of 2011 was thick with a damp, clinging fog that seemed to rise directly from the Seine. It was a cold that settled in the bones of the city, turning the cobblestones slick and the air heavy with the scent of river water and old stone. For the officers of the Brigade de Répression du Banditisme, the elite organized crime unit, this was not a morning for coffee and contemplation. They moved with a quiet, practiced lethality toward a specific address, a building that stood like a silent sentinel overlooking the gray ribbon of the river. Inside, they believed, were the answers to a mystery that had embarrassed the French state for nearly a year. The target was the world of Jonathan Byrne, a man whose life was measured in the delicate ticks of luxury watches, but whose hands were now suspected of holding something far more volatile. As the police vehicles pulled to a halt, the only sound was the low thrum of engines and the distant, rhythmic lap of water against the embankments. The ascent up the staircase was a slow, deliberate procession. Each step of their heavy boots on the aged wood felt like a heartbeat in the silence of the pre-dawn hour. They were looking for 5 ghosts. They were looking for the vibrant ochres of the Picasso, the lush, dreamlike greens of the Matisse, and the fractured, rhythmic shapes of the Braque. When the door to the apartment was finally breached, the atmosphere inside was a stark contrast to the sterile halls of the museum. It was a space defined by the clutter of a life lived among beautiful things. There was the smell of fine oil used for clockwork, the dry scent of old paper, and the faint, metallic tang of watch parts scattered across workbenches. The investigators fanned out, their eyes scanning not for jewelry or cash, but for the specific dimensions of canvas and frame. They moved with a meticulous, almost reverent slowness, aware that a single careless movement could damage a piece of history worth more than the building itself. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on the suspects and the seekers alike. Jonathan Byrne stood there, a man caught between the precision of his craft and the chaos of a crime he could no longer contain. The investigators began the physical deconstruction of the room. They pulled back heavy oak wardrobes that had likely not moved in decades, their eyes searching the dark, dusty voids behind the wood. They hoped to see the edge of a gilded frame or the dull sheen of a rolled canvas tucked away in the shadows. There is a specific kind of silence that accompanies a search like this, a silence broken only by the rasp of furniture against floorboards and the sharp, rhythmic tapping of knuckles against walls. They were listening for a hollow sound, the telltale echo of a hidden compartment or a false back. Every shadow was an invitation, every closed drawer a possibility. Under the beds, inside the linings of winter coats, and behind the stacks of horological journals, they looked for the missing masterpieces. As the hours stretched on, the search moved to the very bones of the apartment. Officers knelt on the floor, their fingers tracing the lines of the parquet, looking for any board that sat just a millimeter higher than the rest. They imagined the paintings lying flat beneath the feet of the inhabitants, protected by the very floorboards they walked upon. They thought of the Modigliani, the woman with her fan, staring up into the darkness of a joist, her elegant, elongated neck hidden from the world. The hope was a flickering flame. In the world of art theft, the first 48 hours after an arrest are often the last chance to recover the works before they vanish into the black market, or, worse, meet a more permanent end. The investigators whispered to one another, their voices hustled as they examined a loose panel in the hallway. They found nothing but dust and the forgotten debris of a century. The frustration began to set in, a cold realization that the canvases were not where they should be. In the center of this storm stood Byrne, his face a mask of escalating panic. He began to speak, and the story he told was a jagged, horrifying narrative that felt like a physical blow to the ears of the art lovers in the room. He spoke of fear, a crushing, paralyzing terror that had seized him when he realized the police were closing in. He described the way the light hit the paintings in his studio, and how that beauty had suddenly turned into a death warrant. He claimed that in a moment of utter desperation, he had taken the 5 canvases, works that had survived wars, revolutions, and the passage of a century, and he had broken them. He told the officers that he had torn the Picasso and the Matisse, and that he had carried the remnants down to the street in the dead of night. He pointed toward the window, toward the ordinary green plastic bins that lined the Parisian streets, claiming he had cast the heritage of humanity into the jaws of a passing garbage truck. The investigators stared at him, their search halting as the weight of his words filled the small apartment. To an art detective, this is the ultimate nightmare, not the theft, but the destruction. They looked at his hands, the hands of a watchmaker capable of the most delicate repairs, and tried to reconcile them with the image of tearing a masterpiece. Some in the room refused to believe it. They continued to tap on the walls, to peer into the vents, and to sift through the most mundane corners of the kitchen. They searched for a lie. They searched for a sign that he was protecting a buyer or a hidden vault. But as the sun climbed higher over the Seine, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the apartment air, the empty spaces began to feel permanent. The 5 frames back at the museum remained empty, and here, in the heart of Paris, the only thing they found was the suffocating presence of a story that, if true, meant the world was a much poorer place than it had been only a few hours before. The air inside the interrogation room was static, heavy with the scent of ozone and the faint, bitter tang of old coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, hypnotic drone that seemed to vibrate against the pale yellow walls. Jonathan Byrne sat hunched in a chair that looked too large for his slight frame. He was a man of delicate precision, a watchmaker by trade, someone whose life was measured in the microscopic movements of gears and springs. But here, under the steady gaze of the investigators, his composure was winding down. His hands, usually so steady when working on a complicated timepiece, were tucked beneath his thighs, as if he were trying to prevent them from shaking apart. The investigators watched him in a silence so profound you could hear the distant, muffled rhythm of the city outside, a world away from the cold, clinical reality of this room. They waited for the truth to emerge from the shadows of his memory, waiting for the moment the mechanism would finally break. When Byrne finally spoke, His voice was a thin, ragged whisper that barely cut through the hum of the lights. He described a day in May 2011 when the weight of his secrets became a crushing burden. He spoke of the rising tide of the investigation, the feeling of invisible eyes watching his every move through the windows of his workshop. He told the detectives that he was convinced he was being followed, that every passerby was an undercover officer, and every glint of light on glass was a lens recording his guilt. The panic had not come as a sudden storm, but as a slow, freezing realization that the walls were closing in. In this state of frantic desperation, he said he reached a breaking point. He told the men across the table that he had committed what he called the worst mistake of his entire existence. He repeated the words 3 times, his voice growing more fractured with each iteration, as if repeating the claim would somehow make the reality of it easier to bear. He claimed that in a moment of pure, unadulterated madness, he retrieved the canvases from their hiding place. These were not just pieces of fabric and pigment. They were the stolen soul of the Museum of Modern Art. He spoke of the Modigliani, the woman with the fan, her elongated neck and melancholic eyes staring back at him from the frame. He spoke of the Picasso, the pigeon with green peas, a cubist dance of shapes that had survived world wars and decades of change. Byrne told the investigators that he took these masterpieces, and with hands that had once repaired the finest watches in Paris, he began to destroy them. He described the sound of the wooden stretcher bars snapping under the weight of his boots, a series of sharp, dry cracks that must have echoed through the silence of his workshop like gunshots. He said he tore the canvases away, folding the history of modern art into small, unrecognizable bundles of cloth and oil. The investigators sat frozen as he described the walk to the communal trash bin. It was an ordinary container, the kind used for the mundane waste of an apartment building, standing on the sidewalk like a green plastic sentinel of the discarded. Byrne claimed he lifted the heavy lid and dropped the 5 masterpieces inside, one by one. The Picasso, the Matisse, the Braque, the Modigliani, and the Ledger. He watched them vanish into the darkness of the bin, buried beneath the coffee grounds and the discarded papers of his neighbors. He told the court later that he was crying as he did it, overcome by the monstrosity of his own actions. To the detectives, the image was almost impossible to process. The idea that over 100 million euros worth of human genius was sitting in a common dumpster, waiting for a garbage truck to arrive, felt like a hole opening up in the center of the world. They pictured the mechanical maw of the truck, the hydraulic press that crushes everything it touches into a singular mass of debris, and they felt a hollow ache in their chests. Disbelief hung in the air like a thick fog. The investigators, who had spent months tracing every lead and analyzing every blurry frame of footage, looked at Byrne with a mixture of horror and profound skepticism. They knew the value of these works, not just in currency, but in the cultural heritage of humanity. Could a man who lived his life surrounded by beauty truly destroy it? They considered the possibility that this was a final, desperate lie designed to protect a buyer or to hide the paintings in a place where they could never be found. They thought of the empty frames found abandoned outside the museum, and the way the thief, the one they called Spider-Man, had handled the works with a strange, criminal reverence. To hear that they had ended their journey in a landfill was a psychological blow that many in the room refused to accept. They searched Byrne's face for a glimmer of deception, for some sign that the masterpieces were still breathing somewhere in the shadows of a private collection. But Byrne remained steadfast in his sorrow, his head bowed, his voice trailing off into the quiet of the room. He spoke of the finality of the garbage truck's arrival, the way the metal bins were hoisted and emptied, and the sound of the engine fading into the distance. If his story was true, the 5 paintings were gone forever, reduced to dust and fibers in the great, indifferent machinery of the city's waste system. The silence that followed his confession was the heaviest kind of silence there is, the kind that follows a tragedy that cannot be undone. The investigators realized that even if they caught every man involved, even if they handed out sentences of 10 or 20 years, the true victims were the silent canvases that could no longer speak to the world. They looked at the watchmaker, a man who understood the value of time, and they realized that in one afternoon of panic, he might have erased a century of beauty. The case was moving toward a conclusion, but it was a conclusion draped in the mourning colors of a permanent, unthinkable loss. The heavy, ornate doors of the Palais de Justice swung open on a morning draped in the persistent gray mist of January, 2017. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with the scent of floor wax and the hushed, anxious whispers of the international press. It had been nearly 7 years since the walls of the Museum of Modern Art were left bare, and finally, the 3 men at the center of the void stood before the bench. The room was a cathedral of wood and stone, where the ticking of the clock seemed to echo the slow, agonizing passage of time since the masterpieces vanished. We find ourselves sitting in the gallery, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of winter light, wondering if the truth will finally emerge from the shadows of 2010. At the front sat Vjeran Tomic, the man the world called the Spider-Man. He was composed, almost serene, his eyes scanning the room with the same analytical precision he surely used to scale the museum's exterior. Beside him was Jean Mitchell Corvez, the aging antiques dealer who had allegedly set the gears in motion, and then there was Jonathan Byrne. Byrne was a different kind of man altogether, a luxury watch expert whose hands, usually accustomed to the delicate movements of clockwork, were now trembling. The court grappled with the sheer scale of the loss, a staggering 104 million euros in physical value, but an immeasurable debt to human history. The judge spoke of a total lack of respect for the common good, a phrase that hung in the air like a cold draft, reminding everyone that this was not just a theft of canvas, but a theft of heritage. Think for a moment of what was missing. The Picasso, a work titled Dove with Green Peas, painted in 1911, its ochre and gray tones a cornerstone of Cubist thought. The Matisse, a lush, vibrant pastoral from 1906, filled with the warmth of an imaginary sun. Then there was the Modigliani, the woman with fan, her neck elongated and elegant, her eyes holding a secret that only she knew. These were not just objects. They were the breath of the early 20th century, frozen in oil and pigment. During the trial, the court spent hours discussing the texture of these works, the specific way the light hit the brack or the industrial strength found in the ledger. To imagine them gone was like imagining a language losing its most beautiful words. The tragedy felt physical, a weight in the chest of every art lover present. Then came the testimony that froze the room. Jonathan Byrne, overcome with tears, repeated a haunting refrain 3 times over. He told the court that he had thrown them into the trash. He described a moment of absolute, blinding panic in May of 2011, when the police began to close in. He spoke of taking the canvases back to his workshop, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he placed the masterpieces on the floor. He described the sound of his own boots as he delivered fierce kicks to the wooden stretcher bars, splintering the frames that had held the art for a century. He told the judge how he stuffed the crumpled, broken remains into a common building dumpster, watching the lid close on the Picasso and the Matisse. It was a vision of cultural execution, a horrific end for works that had survived world wars and revolutions. But the court remained profoundly skeptical. The judge, the prosecutors, and even Byrne's own co-defendants found the story impossible to swallow. Tomic himself insisted that Byrne was far too intelligent, far too appreciative of beauty to destroy such treasures. There was a lingering theory, a whisper that refused to die, suggesting the paintings were never destroyed. Instead, the narrative suggested a journey across borders, perhaps hidden away in a secret vault in Israel, or tucked into the private collection of a shadow buyer who cared nothing for the law. The investigators believed the works were spirited out of France, existing now in a ghost gallery where no public eye would ever see them again. The mystery of the garbage became a central point of the trial, a riddle of whether the art was truly ash or merely resting in a dark, cold silence. When the verdict was finally read, the sentences felt like a closing of the book, but not the end of the story. Vjeran Tomic was given 8 years, Jean Mitchell Corvez received 7, and Byrne was sentenced to 6 years, a punishment he met with a scream of anguish toward the bench. They were ordered to pay a joint fine of 104 million euros, a sum so vast it seemed almost symbolic. As the 3 men were led away, a profound silence returned to the Palais de Justice. The trial of the century had ended, but the walls of the museum remained empty. The 5 paintings were still out there, somewhere, either buried under layers of city refuse or waiting in a hidden room for a light that may never come. We are left only with the memory of their colors, fading slowly into the quiet of the night. The Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris stands as a silent sentinel along the Seine, its limestone walls holding a history of both creation and disappearance. In the years following the heist of 2010, the museum has undergone a transformation that is as much psychological as it is physical. When you walk through those galleries today, there is a certain quality to the air, a density that was not there before the night of May 20th. The empty spaces where the 5 masterpieces once hung became, for a long time, the most famous exhibits in the building. Visitors would stand before the velvet-textured white of the walls, staring at the ghosts of frames, trying to visualize the vibrant greens of the Matisse or the fragmented cubist planes of the Picasso. It was a void that felt heavier than the art itself, a recurring reminder of how easily 1,000 years of cultural evolution can be unbolted and carried into the dark. The legacy of that night lives on in the rhythmic, barely audible hum of a security system that is now among the most sophisticated in the world. After the investigation revealed that the alarms had been malfunctioning for weeks prior to the theft, a wave of reform swept through the French Cultural Ministry. It was a deafening wake-up call that echoed from the Louvre to the smallest provincial galleries. Millions of euros were poured into obsidian-black cameras that see in the dark, and sensors that breathe with the building, sensitive to the slightest change in the air's vibration. The 3-night watchmen of 2010, who sat in their booth while Vjeran Tomic moved through the rooms like a shadow, have been replaced by layers of technological oversight. The museum is now a fortress of light and logic. Yet the transition from laxity to vigilance was born of a profound sense of loss that no amount of steel or glass can ever truly repair. In the trial of 2017, the world listened with bated breath as the fate of the paintings was discussed in the sterile environment of a Parisian courtroom. The testimony of Jonathan Byrne, the man who allegedly hid the works, remains one of the most heartbreaking chapters in art history. He wept as he told the judges that he had panicked, that he had broken the wooden stretchers and cast the canvases of Picasso and Modigliani into a common trash bin. He described the sound of the garbage truck coming in the morning, a mechanical monster that supposedly ground the 20th century's greatest treasures into nothingness. The image he painted was one of total desecration, masterpieces resting between coffee grounds and wet cardboard. But the investigators never quite believed him. They noted his intelligence, his expertise in luxury watches, and the way his voice trembled. They believed, and many still believe, that those paintings were too valuable to be destroyed by a man who understood their worth. This lingering doubt is the true legacy of the Spider-Man heist. It is a mystery that refuses to settle, a hope that keeps the case files from gathering dust. Somewhere in the world, perhaps in a climate-controlled vault or behind a false wall in a private study, the dove with green peas might still be resting. The colors, the earthy browns, the muted grays, the vibrant life of the pastoral, are perhaps only waiting for the right moment to resurface. There is a specific kind of patience required for the recovery of stolen art. It is a game played in decades, not days. We remember the Gardner Museum. We remember the heists of the past where works appeared 40 years later in the attic of a quiet home. The search continues in the digital shadows and the quiet corners of the black market, driven by the belief that beauty has a way of surviving the men who try to possess it. The names of the thieves, Vjeran Tomic, Jean Mitchell Corvez, and Jonathan Byrne, have become footnotes to the art they took. Their sentences of 8, 7, and 6 years have largely been served, and the fine of 104 million euros remains a debt to a city that can never truly be repaid in currency. As the years pass, the heist feels less like a crime and more like a legend, a story told in hushed tones to new students of art history. The museum has filled the gaps on its walls with other works, other visions of the modern world, but the ghosts of the stolen five remain part of the building's identity. They represent the fragility of our shared heritage and the enduring power of the human imagination to create things so beautiful that men would risk everything to touch them, if only for an hour in the cold, blue light of a May morning. The city of Paris continues to breathe. The lights of the Eiffel Tower still sweep across the roof of the museum, and the river flows on, indifferent to the treasures lost or found. We are left with the silence of the galleries and the quiet hope that one day a crate will be found or a confession will be whispered and the colors will return to the light. But for now, the story concludes here, in the stillness of the night. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.